So, recent revelations of Chapter 248 of JJK have left the entire fandom reeling. Gojo's body was scooped up, Rika and Yuta have broken onto the stage to battle against Sukuna, and the Executioner Blade strategy did not work. But in the midst of all these massive revelations, one revelation is flying slightly under the radar, and that is the fact that Sukuna, or possibly Megami, now has the ability to initiate the merger between Japan and Tengen. And while to many, this addition to the plot might just seem like a way to heighten tensions in this final battle between Sukuna, Rika, and Yuta, as if Yuta and Yuji lose in this battle against Sukuna, he'll be able to kill the entirety of Japan through the merger, others believe that Sukuna being given the right to merge all of Japan with Tengen is actually Gege showing his final card. But what do I mean by this? Well, it's rather simple, actually. See, while many believe that there is no way that the merger would ever happen between Tengen, all of Japan, because that would kill almost the entirety of the Japanese populace, and I say almost the entirety of the Japanese populace because maybe Hokkaido was exempt, and thus if the entirety of the Japanese populace is merged with Tengen, there goes, oh, I don't know, every character from this story. The theory that we're going to be talking about today dictates that the merger is not just a possibility, but a foregone conclusion, and thus it's inevitable that all of Japan will either die or simply just be merged with Tengen. But this theory goes further and says that that merge with Tengen may not be a bad thing. In fact, the merging with Tengen may not only just save the world, but will also save the world exactly how Geto wanted it to be saved. And the hope of the entirety of humanity lays on the shoulders of Yuji, who may possibly be able to take control of Super Tengen. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're talking about a theory that Yuji will control the entirety of Japan's population through the flesh mech that is Tengen, and it all happened because Geto is secretly pulling the strings behind the facade of Kenjaku. And if that sounds like a lot for you to comprehend, don't worry, we got another 25 minutes of this voice yapping for you to understand. Before we get into the yapping, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you like the concept of me talking endlessly, then you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you guys are massive JJK fans, then you're gonna love the brand new t-shirts we just dropped in my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where we've split this delusional fan base into two sides, those who believe it is Gojover, and those who believe it's not. See, whether you like it or not, anime is somewhat predictable. Now, it's not to say that anime is more predictable than standard types of media, because inherently it's not. Anime is a medium, not a way of telling stories. But popular anime and popular media as a whole do tend to follow some rather arbitrary scripts. And therefore, in the confines of anime and manga, at least popular anime and manga, there tends to be a couple of things known as rules. And one of the most standard anime and manga rules is that if the worst case scenario is introduced, it will happen. Now, obviously, the worst case scenario won't play out to fruition, but we always see the start of the worst case scenario, and that's classic storytelling. If a character is trying to ascend to their highest level of power, they will always achieve that final transformation. If a character is trying to bring about the apocalypse, they'll always be able to initiate the first and possibly last part of their plan, but they'll be foiled somewhere along that journey. This is just good storytelling. If I told you I have some evil plan that's gonna be really cool and it's gonna bring the main characters into this perilous fight, you're going to want to see that end game scenario. And while you don't want to see that end game scenario become the end game, introducing something like a final form and never showing it is kind of a tease. And readers and viewers don't like teases, they like payoff. And this is the case in tons of popular anime and manga. It's the case with Aizen and Yahaba and Bleach. It's the case in FMAB with Father, and the case with Madara and Naruto. All of these characters achieved exactly what they wanted to achieve. Father gets another Sorcerer's Stone and is able to create mini suns in his hand. Madara gets all three Rinnegan. Aizen gets his final form. Yahaba becomes the Soul King. All of these final villains become as powerful as humanly possible. But because of the perseverance of the main character and their ability to rise above that villain, they're able to stop the doomsday scenario that these final villains are trying to enact. Which is why, the second it was revealed that Sukuna now has the ability to initiate the merger, I knew it was gonna happen. Or at least that it was going to start. It just makes narrative sense. Whether or not you want to see all of Japan warped into Tengen, you have to admit that a battle between Sukuna and Super Tengen being the end of JJK would be awesome. Not to mention, it would literally pit Sukuna and Kenjaku versus the entirety of the Japanese populace. That is to say that narratively, it would pit the indomitable human spirit versus the curses made from their weakest and worst moments. The opportunity for a good narrative ending there almost writes itself, as the collective force of Japan rallies together through the entity that is Super Tengen in order to defeat something made from their worst emotions and fears. I mean, that's just the perfect ending to the story. Not to mention, there's a pretty good chance that after the entire Japanese populace is merged into Tengen, they would, assuming that after they defeat Sukuna, they'd be able to separate back into individuals, all be introduced to and awoken to cursed energy, which would mean post the fight against Sukuna, the entirety of the Japanese populace would leak less cursed energy, making everybody a sorcerer of sorts. And thus, cursed spirits would stop manifesting in Japan. And since cursed spirits really only manifest in Japan, in any meaningful capacity that is, this would essentially extinct cursed spirits, pacifying and saving the world. Now, that is assuming that the populace would be able to split up from Tengen. But as crazy as this might sound, the populace being unable to split up from Tengen might actually be more likely than them being able to split up after the fight against Sukuna. Shigege in 2018 did an interview, a rather interesting interview that yielded one of the most interesting and unnerving answers to a question we could have hoped for. Shigege, when asked about how the story was going to end for Gojo in the first years, responded that either only one of them would die or all of them, but one would die. Which means, with the information that we have currently, that either Gojo will be the only person out of Gojo in the first years to die, or everyone but Yuji will die, which appears as though, as the plot is currently going, could be a serious possibility. Nobara, while currently in stasis, was placed in stasis with no heartbeat. Gojo is in half, and Megami is currently drowning within an endless pit of negative cursed energy inside of Sukuna's, I guess, body, but he's still in his own body. It's not good for Megami right now, and thus the likelihood that Yuji is going to be the only survivor out of the first years and Gojo is becoming more and more likely by the minute. But wait, Yuji is a part of the Japanese populace, right? And therefore, if the entirety of the Japanese populace is absorbed into Tengen, Yuji would be absorbed too, right? So if he was absorbed into Tengen upon the merger coming to completion, could that truly be considered alive? I would say yes, and not for the reasons you're expecting. See, well, sure, I can make the argument that Yuji would still be alive because he was part of a hive mind. Vast hive mind of the entirety of Japan's 125 million people residing within Tengen. But that's not the argument I'm going to make, because that's, well, it's kind of stupid. No, instead this theory dictates that if Yuji were to be absorbed into Tengen, he would be alive within Tengen, for the same reasons that Yuji was alive within Sukuna. And while I understand that Sukuna was in Yuji and not the other way around, I believe that if Yuji were to merge with Tengen, he would able to, because of his unique genetics and makeup, be able to dominate Tengen in the same way that he dominated Sukuna. See, Yuji's unique makeup, which was augmented and created by Kenjaku, allowed him to be the perfect vessel for Sukuna. And it's been widely implied by the story, but never outright stated, that Yuji was created for exactly this purpose. For the purpose of being the vessel of incomprehensibly strong entities like Sukuna. And therefore, Yuji was able to keep Sukuna at bay from very early on in the manga. In fact, after consuming the first of Sukuna's 20 fingers, Yuji is able to allow Sukuna to take control of his body for 10 seconds, and then is able to wrestle control back after Gojo is done beating down on Sukuna. And this isn't because Gojo weakened Sukuna, this is because Yuji had control over his body. And really, the only times that Sukuna's ever been able to take control of Yuji's body, and Yuji hasn't been able to wrestle it back, is either after moments where he's fed way too many fingers, like in the Shibuya incident where he's fed 10, or any time that Sukuna says in chain, which grants Sukuna control over Yuji's body for a minute because of a binding vow that Yuji was forced into. But still, that only grants him control over Yuji's body for a minute. But why is Yuji so incredibly well versed in the control of Sukuna? Well, Yuji is most likely able to control Sukuna because A, Kenjaku is his mother, and B, the fact that Yuji might actually be the reincarnation of a sorcerer from the Heian period, specifically brought to this era by Kenjaku to operate in the capacity of being a vessel for Sukuna. As we already know from the Culling games, that Kenjaku has the capacity to make contracts with sorcerers from the past to bring them to the present, as half of the fighters in the Culling games are sorcerers brought from the past to the present by Kenjaku. Now, the only slight problem with making this argument is obviously the fact that Kenjaku doesn't have idle transfiguration until he absorbs Mahito, and he uses idle transfiguration to activate all of the cursed objects that he placed in the sorcerers to bring those past sorcerers into their bodies. And thus it raises the question of then, okay, then how did Kenjaku manage to make Yuji a sorcerer from the past? And we don't really know. We just have a couple of occasions when Sukuna was brawling toe-to-toe against Yuji, where Sukuna implied or thought that Yuji was from that period, which we all believe was obviously the Heian period. And Sukuna making a connection like this happened as recently as, I believe, chapter 247. But all of this is to say, what if Sukuna wasn't the main target all along? What if the real entity that Yuji was made to control was Tengen? See, the idea that Kenjaku wanted to merge all of Japan with Tengen for the hell of it never really sat well with me. And that's mostly because that's not really the reason Kenjaku wants to merge all of Japan with Tengen. See, that's a simplification of a slightly more complicated answer. The real reason Kenjaku wants to merge all of Japan with Tengen is the refinement of cursed energy to bring back the golden age of Jujutsu. But this also doesn't sit right with me, because while sure, technically maybe merging all of Japan with Tengen would refine cursed energy and make an entity of unstoppable force that would be under Kenjaku's control, it would also eliminate the entirety of the Jujutsu world, creating a singular entity that represents 99.99% of cursed energy on Earth. And while some could make the argument that, yeah, Kenjaku wants the Jujutsu Society dead, and therefore this is kind of a win-win for him, and that would be fair, for some reason, the refinement of cursed energy, looking like a giant super Tengen that represents almost the entirety of cursed energy on Earth, doesn't sit right with me. And thus, my theory is twofold, as it heads in kind of two separate directions that eventually come back together in the end. My theory dictates, well, I guess I shouldn't call it my theory, as the basis for this theory was brought forward to me by an incredible emailer and his wife, Stephen and Beatrice, but as with any theory emailed to me, I elaborated on it rather massively, and thus the elaborated theory, built off the theory emailed to me, dictates that Japan will be merged with Tengen, and Super Tengen will battle against Sukuna. But Yuji's abilities as a vessel to immeasurably powerful entities will shine through, and thus Yuji will operate as a star plasma vessel of sorts, but in reverse, as he will take control of Tengen, who, as we all know, is as vulnerable as they've ever been to merging and being controlled, and Yuji, in control of the Super Tengen hive mind, will use the power of the Japanese populace to defeat Sukuna. And thus, in this moment, narratively, Yuji will be surrounded by everybody, which is a full circle moment for him, as the entirety of the story has been about stripping the people that Yuji loves away from him. As quite literally in the first episode and in the first chapter, Yuji is introduced after losing his grandfather, the last remaining part of his family he supposedly has. And every single episode and chapter after that has introduced people into Yuji's life to only have them later stripped away. And thus, by Yuji stepping up into the role of pilot of the Tengen mech, will not only be able to defeat the system that's been stripping these people he loves away from him, but will also do it surrounded by everybody he still has. And thus this will reveal the strength of his composition and why he was created by Kenjaku in the first place. But why would Kenjaku make him specifically with the idea in mind to defeat Sukuna as Super Tengen? Well, that's so Kenjaku could achieve exactly what he wanted, the refinement of cursed energy. See, remember what we talked about earlier about how all of Japan being merged into Tengen would most likely awaken every single one of them to cursed energy? Well, that could absolutely be categorized as the refinement of cursed energy, because even though there would be less or no cursed spirits, the level of Jujutsu sorcery would rise, and the Culling Games is a massive testament to that fact. It's Higuruma, who's only been a sorcerer for 2 months, has already actively been compared to Gojo in terms of his potential as a genius. And thus, if the entire population, 125 million people in Japan, had the opportunity to awaken to cursed energy, this kind of story could become commonplace. But further than that, an ending like this would also be in line with Geto's perfect envisioned ending for Japan. And thus, the second half of my theory becomes apparent. See, rather obviously, we all know that Kenjaku was able to take over Geto's body after Gojo and Yuta killed him. But we don't know all the details on how Kenjaku's curse technique works. We know that it allows him to pop the top of his brain off and pop the top of a dead body's brain off and crawl his little brain body into a new body to get all of their techniques and memories. And thus, if Kenjaku ever stumbles upon somebody he wants to be, he simply either has to kill them or just wait for them to die, so that eventually he can inhabit their bodies, get their cursed techniques, their cursed energy, and their memories. And that's kind of it. But as for what happens to the dead body that Kenjaku is currently inhabiting, we don't really know. Is it a symbiotic relationship? Does it bring the person who's recently dead back to life in some capacity? Does it work like Sukuna and Megami's current relationship, where Megami is aware of what his body is doing but has no control of it? But the one thing that we do know about Kenjaku, and more importantly his relationship with Geto's body, is that Geto is the only person in Kenjaku's 1,000-year life that has ever shown the ability to fight back. As when Gojo was being sealed in the prison realm, as Gojo stood there and goaded on Geto's body, asking him if he would be controlled by Kenjaku forever, Geto's body grabbed Kenjaku by the neck, which Kenjaku laughed about and said it had never happened before. And while some might say that's because protecting Gojo was muscle memory to Geto, I would go another way and say that Geto is actually the first of Kenjaku's vessels strong enough to battle against Kenjaku and recede control of his body, even if just for a short while. And this moment is meant to show us that Geto is still in there. And if Geto is still in there, he could be influencing Kenjaku's goals. That is to say that perhaps without even Kenjaku knowing, Geto has been altering Kenjaku's plans so that Kenjaku's plans would achieve what Geto's plans for Japan truly were, which is why Kenjaku and Geto's plans are so eerily similar. See, while Kenjaku's plan is the refinement of cursed energy to reintroduce the Heian period to Japan, Geto's plans for Japan was to kill all non-sorcerers and have this terrifying countrywide massacre be scary enough that a lot of non-sorcerers actually awoke to sorcery, has heightened emotional moments, and being backed into a corner actually awaken a lot of people to cursed energy. And thus, once all non-sorcerers are eradicated from Japan, the country will only be left with sorcerers who emit very little cursed energy, and thus cursed spirits would be eradicated. Now, this idea was propagated into Geto's brain through a conversation with Yuki, who established that it would be a possibility that killing all non-sorcerers could be a way to rid Japan of cursed spirits, but who was committed to finding a better way to rid Japan of cursed spirits than genocide. But still, the end goal of both Kenjaku and Geto's plans is the eradication of non-sorcerers, whether that be through merging everybody with Tengen and awakening them to cursed energy, or just by killing all non-sorcerers. And thus, the person to inherit Kenjaku's will isn't Sukuna, but instead Yuji, like we all originally thought. And Sukuna gaining the ability to merge everybody with Tengen is simply a very clever technique used by Kege to throw us off the scent. See, because when Kenjaku had his head lopped off by Yuta, the first person that everybody thought of when Kenjaku said somebody will inherit my will is Yuji, but we didn't know how he would inherit his will. And now that Sukuna has inherited the ability to initiate the merger from Kenjaku, which seemed to be a post-mortem contingency plan made by Kenjaku in order to make sure that his plans would come to fruition even after his death, it was natural for us to say, oh, Sukuna's got the ability to do what Kenjaku wanted to do, and thus he is the inheritor of Kenjaku's will. And to a sense, he kind of is. But in actuality, the real inheritor of Kenjaku's will is Yuji, the thing we all thought from the jump, because Yuji will be the pilot of Super Tengen. And by Yuji taking control of Super Tengen and defeating Sukuna, the last remaining cursed spirit, Yuji and the Japanese populace will either stay as Super Tengen or split back up into individuals, but all individuals awoken to cursed energy. And thus, the cursed energy of Japan will be refined, making Yuji the inheritor of Kenjaku's overarching will. And thus, in conclusion, the merger will happen. Yuji will take control of Super Tengen and beat Sukuna. And all of Japan will either split back up, awoken to cursed energy, or Yuji will exist as the entity that is Super Tengen alone forever. I genuinely can't decide which of these two endings is more likely, but even if Yuji remains as the individual Super Tengen, he will still represent the cure to cursed energy, as the entire populace now existing in the body of a super sorcerer who admits next to no cursed energy would eradicate cursed energy being leaked. And all of this happened because Geto, Kenjaku's final vessel, was able to manipulate Kenjaku from the shadows in order to augment the ending of this story to reflect the ending he always wanted: the elimination of non-sorcerers. And in the end, Geto wins. But he accomplishes his goal without genocide. And it's a possibility that the introduction of somebody as powerful as Kenjaku, paired with his defeat at the hands of his lover Gojo, awoke Geto to the fact that the way that he was going about eliminating all non-sorcerers was not the way to do things. And thus, JJK, somewhat surprisingly, is left with a happy ending. And genuinely, as crazy as it sounds to try and predict things in JJK, I can't see the ending being all that far off from this. But What do you guys think? If you had to hypothesize what you believe the ending of JJK will look like, what would that look like? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And listen, if this isn't the ending and I'm way off base, blame Beatrice.